know this is something that nobody likes to think about, but it's a fact of life. So it's a fact of life. Sorry, I have my out there. But we're looking forward to hearing from him. He's going to discuss some things with us, and I'm sure it will be very forthcoming and interesting. So, Peter, I'd like to pass you the.
Can you all hear me without the microphone? You can't? Okay, I'll use the mic then and see if I could project it a little bit better. This is one of a series that the Alzheimer's Association does. It's called Building the Foundations of Caregiving. And it's something that is applicable to a lot of people because virtually anybody can be a caregiver to an Alzheimer's patient. It doesn't have to be a relative, somebody living in your house. You can volunteer to give, for instance, respite care. Very often when you're in the house with somebody and you're trying to take care of them by yourself, as you well know from your husband's experience, it really does wear you down a lot of times. And I've often thought that one of the good service projects that Optimists or Rotary or Kiwanis could do would be to sort of have like a respite care registry where we would volunteer to give a break to people who are trying to take care of Alzheimer's patients solo, not with anyone's help there. So I'm going to keep on working on that little thing. I also lead a support group from caregivers of those who have Alzheimer's and dementia. Tomorrow is our meeting. We meet the third Wednesday at 1:30 in the senior center down there by the hospital. If you've never been to the senior center, it's a great facility. You ought to check it out at one point or another. So here are a few things that we're out to do there. Identifying caregivers, describing how you do a person-centered approach to caring for somebody with Alzheimer's. You could read that. I'm not big on reading slides to people. So caregiver is not necessarily somebody who's taking care of a spouse, a father, a mother, a grandparent. Those are caregivers. But a caregiver is anyone who does anything to help out with an Alzheimer's patient. It could be something as simple as going down to Kroger, right? Getting some groceries for the patient. It could be something as simple as sitting with the patient for an hour or two while somebody attends a support group meeting. So caregivers can take on a whole number of different roles. And most people who provide care to a family member don't have any sort of formal training. It's something that you fall into, right? And at first, it's very, very easy to feel overwhelmed when you first get the diagnosis and you're like, okay, I'm not really sure what I'm doing, but I'm going to give it a try anyway. So there are ways that you can sort of prepare for your role as a caregiver, and that is pretty much to know what's coming at you is the best way of doing it. To learn about dementia and Alzheimer's. And dementia, by the way, is the umbrella term. Alzheimer's is a particular kind of dementia. It's the most commonly diagnosed. And Alzheimer's does tend to be more aggressive than other forms of dementia. Very often what will happen is that a doctor will diagnose a patient with dementia, and that'll be it. They won't try to diagnose it any further simply because there is no cure. There's no cure for Alzheimer's, there's no cure for dementia. There are some drugs that doctors can and will prescribe to address symptoms. Like, for instance, everyone talks about the first thing they get is Aricept, which is a drug that helps increase cognition, increase those neurons firing in the brain. Very often you'll get drugs that'll address agitation symptoms. Very often a patient will get agitated, especially when they get frustrated with not being able to do what they once did. We do have a couple of drugs, the most popular of which is Kinsula from Eli Lilly, that was just approved less than a year ago. And what that does is it takes away some of the amyloid plaques in the brain that are associated with Alzheimer's. We talk about the plaques and the tangles. Well, it helps take away the plaques, and the theory is that delays the onset of the more serious symptoms. So that's been clinically proven, and it helps, but again, we still don't have that cure that we need that'll stop the disease in its tracks, or that'll even reverse the damage. That's the holy grail that everyone is working for. And as I tell people, we're pretty fortunate to be up the road from Lexington, where they have the Saunders Brown Center for Aging. They moved, I was told, by where the former Turfwood Mall was. Somewhere back in there, they were in UK, but I've been told that they moved. And that's sort of it's a world-class facility. That's where they do a lot of the clinical trials. So one of the things you can do if you or a loved one is diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia is get in on one of the clinical trials. You may be taking the next drug, the next best treatment that we have out there. So that's one of the things you might want to consider. And I just learned last night, every time I give some of these talks, I learn something new. I learned last night that the Saunders in Saunders Brown is Colonel Sanders, the KFC guy. I did not know that. I've been saying Sanders Brown all the time. I did not know that it was Colonel Sanders who did that. This obviously is a true thing. Anyone who helps with anything involving an Alzheimer's or dementia patient is considered a caregiver. So caregivers are sort of different flavors. That is, a caregiver can be somebody who lives full time with the person suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, or somebody who just helps out some of the time. It really depends upon the severity of the disease and also what people are willing to do. One of the situations that I ran into with my own father is I was living in Kentucky and he was still living in New York. So there was really very little I could do by way of caregiving. I could just visit every now and then and help out my mom. But that's become a relatively common situation. My son lives in Columbus, Ohio. My daughters live in San Diego. So if I start to show symptoms that, I can't really rely on them so much. So, I'm kind of hoping that, some of the community members will help out there. So a caregiver can do any number of these things. And again, if a caregiver is a paid caregiver, more with a little bit more nursing experience, then they'll do things like helping with bathing, helping using the toilet, and things like that. For those of us who just want to help out, go buy some groceries. And like I said, the one thing that I can tell you from my support group, they would appreciate tremendously just stay with the person suffering from Alzheimer's for a couple of hours so you can get out and attend an Optimist meeting or support group or go to the grocery store, something like that. So here are the latest statistics, and I think that these are low. These skew low. One of the reasons is that we're talking about diagnosed cases, and you might know somebody who is showing signs but refuses to go to the doctor. Another thing I've heard from several people after giving these presentations is that, we took grandma to the doctor and she completely denied that there was anything going on. So because the disease is not good news, I kind of wonder how many more there are than the 6 million that have been diagnosed. I kind of think that's a low figure. And it's the same way with the 11 million caregivers. That figure might very well be on the low side because caregivers come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and professional training. Mostly we have caregivers are typically tend to be family members. That is, we look after our own relatives. Pretty true across the United States. And I don't know how they came up with this, the survey. Although 64% say caregiving is stressful, 92% say it's rewarding. I don't know how they came up with that, but I agree with the stressful part. This is the most stressful thing you'll ever take on. But as I like to say, as optimists, I think that you'll agree that one of the best things that we could be doing is being there for somebody who needs us to be there, which is exactly what a caregiver does, right? Caregiver is taking on a very, very difficult role. But I think that we all would like to think, again, as optimists, and I used to be an optimist. I was an optimist in Macon, Georgia, in the Macon, Georgia Club. But one of the things I like to think that we would all be there, when the chips are down, right? When somebody really, really needs us to be there, I like to think that we would all take on that role. And so, you got to tip your hat to these caregivers because they're putting their money where their mouth is. They're putting it on the line for their loved ones. A few changes that you may experience. The taking on new roles, I can tell you from my parents' experience. My dad worked for a bank, Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, which is now J.P. Morgan Chase, and he handled the finances. My parents had a typical traditional marriage, where my dad was the breadwinner and took care of all the finances, and my mom just let him because he was great at it. My dad never bounced a check, never missed a payment on anything. He was good at it. He was really good at it until the disease struck. And then one of the roles my mom had to take on was paying the bills, something she literally had never done at any point in their marriage. But sometimes you got to do that. If the person that is suffering from the disease used to make most of the meals, you're going to have to do that now. As a caregiver, you're going to have to take that on. So one of the things that you can do, talking about taking on new roles, is usually while the person is in the first stage, mild cognitive impairment, start to talk to that person about things like, what would you still like to do around here? What do you envision the future for being like? Would you prefer to stay in this home for as long as possible? Things like that. So you have to have a conversation while you still can. I kind of regret not having that conversation with my dad. I sort of led it up to my mom, and my mom sometimes emotionally was, struggling with that. I can tell that. Yeah, there are going to be relationship changes. However, what you know is that the person you know and love is still in there. They may be behaving differently because of the disease, and a lot of times that different behavior is not a positive behavior. One of the ladies at the talk I gave last night in Cynthiana said that, yeah, her husband once tried to choke her. Her husband was nicest, gentlest man in the world. But sometimes behavioral changes happen, and you have to, take into account that that's going to change the relationship. So even the fact that one person is going to be doing most of the stuff is going to change most of the relationships that are out there. So what you want to do is you want to, reach out, tell them that you value their friendship, that you still love them, and that you're okay with that. And of course, intimacy is going to change too. So instead of sexual intimacy, usually you have to seek another form of intimacy: bathing, holding hands, listening to music together. Typically, you have to go for something like that, which I don't think the sound is working. So I'll just go over to the person-centered approach to care. Basically, what this means, it's a fancy way of saying that most caregivers know the patient better than anyone else. If it's a spouse, if it's a parent, if it's a grandparent, if it's an uncle, aunt, you tend to know a lot about that person, and you tend to know what that person responds to. And very often you want to bring that knowledge that you have to bear. This presentation, you got to keep getting pricky. You have to keep pressing next, and it's driving me nuts. There you go. Skip one there. One of the benefits for the person living with dementia, fewer dementia-related behaviors, particularly aberrant behaviors. They just simply not like the person. Less boredom, lower agitation, and of course an increase in happiness and a sense of well-being. So if the person doesn't feel like they're being a burden, if the person feels like, this is the same loving relationship I've always had, it's just changing a little bit, that'll help out. And of course, there is some advantages for caregivers. And I think the bottom line is you really get to feel good about yourself because you're doing something that you didn't sign up for and you probably never envisioned happening. And yet you're there. You are there, you're providing that help. That I think that's the number one benefit is that you really can feel good. If you I think we all suspect that we're good people. This is a great way of proving to yourself, if ever you doubt, that you are a really good person. So a few things that you can do is use your knowledge of the person is the first one. I like to tell the story of I actually read this in the New York Times. A lot of people don't. One of the things that never occurred to me is with more and more people getting sentenced to life in prison, that prisons have to have memory care units now because the same proportion of the population that suffers from Alzheimer's and dementia is suffering from that in the prison. And so there's one prison has a memory care unit, and the trustees are the ones who are volunteering to help out. And the story I read was there was this one patient who got very, very easily frustrated and agitated, but he was a big fan of Tom Brady, the football player. And whenever he got frustrated or agitated, one of the trustees would go over to him and say, "Hey, do you like Tom Brady?" And it would immediately calm him down. They'd start talking about Tom Brady. Now you got to remember, one of the symptoms of Alzheimer's is short-term memory loss. And so every time the trustee went up to this guy and started talking about Tom Brady, that had never happened before. That was to the patient. That was the first time anyone had taken the time to talk about how great Tom Brady was. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that you know the person, you know what the person's interests are, and you could use those interests to divert the person when the person's getting a little bit irritated, a little bit frustrated. So consider what makes that person unique. Are they into bird watching? Are they into music? Are they into art? Do they like taking nature walks? Those are good things to bring to bear when you're having a really difficult time. And this disease is like any other disease. You have good days and you have bad days. So when you're having one of those bad days, the recognized things to do is diversion. Steer them onto something else, perhaps something that that the person likes. Now the person's hobbies may change over time, but one of the interesting parts of the disease is the last thing to go is long-term memory. Like, for instance, I have in my support group a pair of sisters who are helping out their sister with dementia. And, one of them asked at one point, "Hey, do you remember this person they all went to high school with?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, he got married to so-and-so." She had a perfect memory of that. She had trouble figuring out how to turn on this pad that they had given her, where there was a matching game that she enjoyed playing. But she could tell you every detail about this guy she went to high school with. Here's another story to illustrate that. I love collecting these stories. One of the employees down at the senior center said that her grandmother, who was suffering from dementia, kept saying to her husband, "I want to go home. I want to go home." And the husband kept coming up with strategies to convince her she was already home. You put her in the truck, drive around the neighborhood and say, "Do you recognize any of these houses?" Take her out to the mailbox, show her the mail with her name on it. But it wasn't until somebody asked her to describe her home that they finally figured out that she was talking about the home she grew up in, her childhood home, which she could describe in great detail. So basically what she was doing is she was remembering the past as if it were the present. And that's a very, very common part of the disease there. Because of short-term memory loss, you really have no choice but to connect to the person in the moment. A lot of times, plans you make for the future are going to go astray. Um, like I said, there's that element of unpredictability. So when you get a moment to, just show how much you love a person, have a moment of intimacy, yeah, you got to take advantage of it. Uh, One of the things that, again, you have to get used to is that the reality of the person who is suffering from the disease is not your reality in many cases, and you cannot talk that person out of their reality. So if the patient says to you, I can't go into the bathroom, the bathtub is full of snakes, you can stand there and say, oh, come on now. How could we get snakes in the bathroom? Where would the snakes have come from? We don't even have snakes around here. Complete waste of time. Instead, a better strategy would be, oh, okay, I'll go in there and get rid of the snakes so that you can go to the bathroom. Oh, there's somebody keeps peeking in the window. Who is that? I don't know. Why do they keep peeking in the window? Bad strategy. There's nobody peeking in there. Don't be silly. Why would they be peeking in your window? Good strategy. I'll go out there and I'll talk to him. I'll tell him that he's upsetting you by peeking in the window, and I'll tell him to please go away. So again, a lot of times you can't talk somebody out. In fact, you cannot talk somebody out of what they're convinced is real. You just have to sort of go with it and adapt to it. So yeah, just sort of see and accept that fact that sometimes they have delusions that are very interesting. Again, another one of my favorite stories. Forgive me if I'm going on too long about these. One of the members of my support group said that she take care of her mom. That her mom was convinced that upstairs in their house were a bunch of army recruiters, and that the two of them had just been inducted into the army and needed to report. Again, where that came from, why that occurred to her, no explanation, but you got to accept it. Right? You're going to say, okay, I guess we're in the army now. Focus on feelings, not on facts. Ask yourself, why do they think there's somebody peeking in the window with me? And if a topic bothers or upsets them, switch the topic. Go into talking about Tom Brady. The other thing is help make activities meaningful, and one of the best ways of doing that is to focus on activities that you can do together. Right, preparing a meal, um, you know, brushing teeth at night. There, creating some art, listening to some music together. So usually, when you have a activity that is a activity that involves both people, that makes it a more meaningful activity for you and also for the Alzheimer's patient there. Another important thing, don't try to plan too much ahead of time. Um, Sort of accept the fact that on certain days things are going to go catastrophically wrong. But here's an advantage. Remember, because of the reset that takes place with short-term memory loss, you have an infinite number of chances to get it right. So if it goes spectacularly wrong on Monday, you got another shot on Tuesday. It's like the person's not going to remember what happened on Monday. So Monday could be a really, really bad day, but Tuesday's another day where you can start over again. Try a slightly different strategy. See if that helps. And like I said, once you find that strategy that works, you can go to that well as often as you want. You know something that works, and you're going to keep on working with it. Focus on a supportive relationship. Basically, what you want to do is you want to not make the person feel like a burden. Make the person feel like, we've always had this loving relationship, and it's still a loving relationship. Nothing has changed about the relationship just because one person has a disease. Another thing you want to do is focus on flexibility. Keep it simple. You want to sort of, pay attention to the signals that somebody is giving you. Remember, there's a difference between somebody signaling a physical discomfort and somebody signaling an emotional discomfort. Now, the physical discomfort is easier to sort of address, right? That you can, if it's too cold in the room, you can turn up the heat. Too warm in the room, you can turn it down. You know, if a person is feeling itchy in the shirt, they can change their shirt. Encourage independence whenever possible. It's always good to, you know, make the person aware that they can do things, that they're not completely helpless. None of us want to feel helpless. And I don't have sound, so I'm going to clip gold now. And finally, create a supportive environment. So you want to make sure that the person knows that you're not being burdened, that this is just a part of a loving relationship. So, you know, talk with the person about how you're doing, what they would like, you know, uh, what they would like to do. The other thing that you can do is you know, suggest some activities, give choices to the person, but keep those choices relatively simple. Instead of saying, "What would you like for lunch?" Try, "I'm making us some sandwiches for lunch. Would you like turkey or ham?" You know, that's much easier to handle than "What would I like for lunch?" Of all the things you could eat there. And of course, the other thing that, again, I'm hoping that you know, the ROK contingency can work on it at some point in the place is, you know, being a part of a support team for the people in our community that are suffering from this disease, some of whom really don't have many people near them. One of the best things that you can do with a support to support somebody, like I said, is just simply spend some time with the person so that they can go out and, you know, go shopping and things like that without having to worry about the person. If you're in a situation where you're in a caregiver situation but you don't have anybody there to help out, use technology. One of the things that we talk about in the support group that everyone in the group uses is we all have these cameras set up in our houses. I have this even though I don't have any patient I'm looking after. But these are really super duper cheap. I'll show you on my little app here. Basically, what it does for every camera that you have, it gives you a little photo of what's going on back in your house. And you can even set these up to give alerts to your cell phone if they have motion. So if, for instance, you set your husband in front of a television set and say, you know, just watch your favorite shows, I'll be back in an hour, I'm just going to support you. If you have a camera on him that'll alert you if he gets up and moves, that way you can sort of look into it. So these are really cheap. You can buy a group of cameras for I'm not sure what they are now, but they're cheap. They're on Amazon and places like that. And you simply set up the cameras, hook them into the internet, and then download the app to your cell phone. And that way you can remotely check on it. So if you don't have a person who is there, again, I'm an advocate of using technology. Do what you can, because you do have to stay active in your own life. One of the things I've heard people say, and it's really a shame, is, you know, I used to blank all the time and I don't do that anymore. I used to attend church every Sunday. I can't do that anymore. I'm afraid of leaving it behind. You know, so I don't go to church anymore. I used to go to water aerobics every Wednesday. I can't do that anymore because I have to be there for him. You know, that's kind of a thing. You've got to be aware that you do need to lead your own life in order to be useful as a caregiver, if you even want to look at it that way. So in building your support team, you might want to ask yourself, okay, who do I have that might want to help out? Who do I have that might want to just sit there for an hour every Wednesday so I can go to my water aerobics? Because after all, self-care is a very important part of the process. One of the things you can do is think about what kind of help you need and how often you need it. And then ask the people around you who's willing to help out with that. So, you know, as the disease progresses, if you're going to keep the person at home, you're probably going to need some more professional level help. That's not too uncommon. That at first it could just be friends, but then it has to be somebody who's trained in nursing or home health care. There's a little exercise you can do at home. Who would I put in part of my team here? And finally, there's caring for yourself. One of the analogies we like to use is, you know how you get on the plane and they say if the cabin depressurizes, these oxygen masks are going to drop from above. Put an oxygen mask on yourself before you go helping anyone else. It's good advice. Take care of yourself or else you're not any good as a caregiver. So there are all sorts of things that you can experience as a caregiver. The one that you can absolutely guarantee is stress. It is going to be very, very stressful. And you have to make sure that, if you are suffering from stress, you do check with your doctor. You don't want to, kill yourself as part of doing this. So stress can lead to a whole bunch of things. We know this as the cortisol levels go up. All sorts of nasty things start to happen to us. So most of you can recognize stress by this point in your life. If you have relaxation techniques, if you do yoga or something like that, you can bring that to bear. But do pay attention to your symptoms. If you find yourself getting overly stressed, like I said, have a talk with your doctor. There are medications and there are support groups and things like that. Be realistic. You are going to have days that are going to be absolutely terrible there. Know that you're doing your best. Assure yourself that you've been thrust into a role you weren't prepared for. Take a break is the big one. Like so that's the one thing that I hear over and over and over and over in my support group is that I am so grateful that my neighbors will come in and just sit with me for an hour just so I can get out of the house. That is such a stress reliever. So get help you need when you need some help there. I'm going to skip over this part here. Managing caregiver stress. I think that's enough. I'll just take some questions from this point on. Any questions about?
Well, I can relate to all.
Yeah, Jimmy can tell you from his own experience with his wife what he's gone through. And Jimmy can also tell you how expensive it is to go to memory care, which is what I always caution people. You're taking care of the person in the house. If you have to go to memory care, that's a very expensive option.
We have a friend that lives not too far away. She was seeing all these little men in her front yard.
Yeah.
And she called the sheriff, and the sheriff would come out. And they sat on the site one night, 10 hours. She was telling me about it. I said, well, why didn't you open the door and let them come in? Well, I never thought of that. But it was all a myth.
I'm glad that the sheriff did that. The sheriff is trying to accommodate her reality. I suspect that they suspected that there were no men running around the property. But again, you can't talk anyone out of that.
One of the problems I've experienced is that Brenda doesn't want to eat. Now, if I'm with her and encourage her,
Right.
she'll eat. But if she's by herself or with some other people, she doesn't eat.
Yep. What happened with my dad, who's a little bit further down the line, is it's almost like he forgot how to eat.
Yeah.
He would put some food in his mouth, and it's almost like he forgot that he had food in his mouth. He'd just sit there.
And she sometimes has a problem with a fork.
Yeah. Well, they have those ergonomic forks that help out with people who have difficulty grasping the fork. I don't know if they have. Do they have those at Dubuque?
I haven't seen it. But
They have them on Amazon if you want to look into them.
she will eat her fingers.
And sometimes that's a better solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. As long as she's eating, that's good news. It's when they stop eating that that's a sign that the disease progressed to that part of
Like some milkshakes.
Yeah.
Oh, milkshake! I like milkshakes. Who doesn't like a milkshake?
It takes like too long.
I think we all love milkshakes. Well, I do have refrigerator magnets here. If anyone wants a refrigerator magnet with the 800 number, and we're available 24/7. That 800 number is staffed by clinicians, and also the website alz.org lists a whole bunch of resources, including local resources. There are local resources, there are online resources. one of the ladies at the presentation I gave last night was talking about a regular Zoom meeting that takes place. It's sponsored by somebody down in North Carolina. But you can join the Zoom meeting, and they have clinicians come in and people who are experts. So there are all sorts of support out there. You just have to find out where it is. Well, thank you for your attention. I really appreciate
Good
it.
job.